So obviously there's a thing called coronavirus that has been going on, and we haven't really had any new MCU movies in the past 2 years. Of course, we had Black Widow last month, which I didn't actually get to cover on here because it was just too long of a video to make when I had little time. But now that I have seen Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, I'm going to do that MCU ranking, which will also include Black Widow, which I didn't cover in that video. So without further ado, let's get into my favourite movie franchise of all time. In last place is Thor: The Dark World. This may be the worst out of the MCU movies, but it isn't an awful movie. Of course, as you can see, my score, it's low, but it's not like a disaster. You know, a lot of things you get. The worst movie in a big franchise is awful or makes a huge mistake. Thor: The Dark World doesn't really make any unforgivable mistakes, but it's just extremely dull and boring. The villain Malekith is honestly one of the most forgettable villains ever. That is all down to the writing. It's not down to the actor at all, but the writing is just so generic. Like, when you think of the word generic, Malekith comes to mind, if you can actually remember who he is, because he's that forgettable. But carrying over from its predecessor, which we'll talk about in a bit, Thor: The Dark World's human characters are a weak aspect, and instead of maybe devoting less screen time to them, they bring in another human character who is very pointless, and that is apparent as we haven't seen that character since this movie. It is the worst movie in this franchise and worst out of the Thor movies, but it does actually improve upon some things where we get to see more of Asgard. We get a deeper look into the brotherly bond of Loki and Thor as they're together more often in this film. But other than that, it can't save this movie from literally being what you put on to fall asleep. Coming in at 24th is Iron Man 2. This was the first time there was a sequel in the MCU, and it failed to live up to its predecessor. It has plot lines which are quite interesting. There's something about an illness which gives us a different perspective of Tony Stark, but it just tries to do too much, and in order to set up that Avengers movie, which does eventually come. The behind the scenes troubles were very obvious, as things were very messy and appeared rushed, and in attempting to get to that Avengers movie by rushing things, they sacrifice a lot of action, because there's only really 2 action scenes that actually come to mind, both including the villain Whiplash, who takes the tone of a comic book movie from the 90s. He's that silly. This sequel is disappointing, but it was a stepping stone towards the Avengers movie, which obviously has changed everything. Coming in at 23rd place is Thor. For the first time in the franchise, Thor takes us to a different world. It is mostly interesting to look at, but when they start doing their medieval-esque dialogue, things are very slow and tedious, boring. You can choose the word. I didn't know how they managed to take us to a completely new environment and still result in tiredness and boredom. To be fair, the Asgardians are all acted well. Chris Hemsworth, Tom Hiddleston, and Anthony Hopkins. Whereas, as I mentioned, the human characters are quite weak. Jane Foster's annoying and just bland. Darcy Lewis, who does get redemption in this universe, in this film, is unbearable for me personally. Kenneth Branagh isn't really a director I agree with a lot of things. I'm not a huge fan, and this is one of those films because it is just way too slow, doesn't feel like a comic book movie, doesn't have that fast pace, and honestly, I just find it really boring. Coming in at 22nd is The Incredible Hulk. This is really considered a dark horse of this universe, as it is almost completely detached from the rest of the universe. Obviously, when we get to Shang-Chi, there is of course Abomination, but it is very unique in the sense that it doesn't feel like a Marvel film. It's darker in tone, the story plays out differently, but I used to be a defender of this film. After rewatching it, I just think it hasn't aged too well, especially with the CGI. It is an interesting watch, there is no regrets watching it, but better things have come. They have kind of sorted out how to properly make their movies in this sort of rhythm. Edward Norton's actually a solid Bruce Banner, and as good as Mark Ruffalo is, I wouldn't have minded to see him carry on, but of course he's difficult to work with, I've heard. And as the Hulk is a big green CGI monster, and this is one of the MCU's first movies, the CGI doesn't look good, it's safe to say. And the same goes for Abomination in the final battle. Even though it's dark, it does look better. It is not great looking CGI, but nonetheless, their final battle is one of the most underrated in this whole franchise. Coming in at 21st is Black Widow. This may be a surprise, but this film just came too late. If it came when it actually took place, it would be interesting, but a mixture of the sequel coming too late because the character is dead, it's not in the time period that it took place in, and not to mention this film was about a week away from releasing and then coronavirus delayed it for a whole year. So that's not down to its fault, but I kind of ran out of fumes, excitement coming into this film, and I wasn't too excited for it even then, so I got what I expected out of it, and there are some great things. Great hand-to-hand combat, a spy tone, interesting new actors, especially portrayed well, especially by Florence Pugh, who I'm looking forward to seeing in the MCU going forth. But another aspect which let me down is the reveal of Taskmaster. I have played both the Avengers game and the Spider-Man game, and they both have pretty solid Taskmasters, and I've read comics. Taskmaster is this really cool hero. I was very disappointed with the reveal in this film and thought it was a bit of a waste of a character. But you know, it's not a bad movie. I had fun, but it's very forgettable and feels like it came too little too late. Coming in at 20th is Captain Marvel. I do think this does get a little bit more hate than it deserves, just because people were already going to hate it before it was released. But yeah, it's not one of the best MCU movies, but there is of course fun to be had with all of these. It was interesting going back to the 80s, seeing a de-aged Nick Fury, which by the way the technology is fantastic. It would have been impressive for one scene, let alone the whole 2-hour runtime. But my issue here is actually Brie Larson. You know, I know a lot of people were disliking her coming into this over remarks, but not even necessarily her, but the character of Carol Danvers is just extremely cocky and quite dislikable, and once, as you know, if you don't like the main character, you're not in for an enjoyable time. There are other things which were a bit disappointing with the reveal of how Nick Fury lost his eye, and also I was excited to see maybe some redemption for Ronan, even though it takes place before Guardians of the Galaxy, but once again, he was just as irrelevant then as he is now. Coming in at 19th place is Iron Man 3. We explore another personal problem with Tony Stark. This time it is his PTSD from the Avengers. But this film is extremely frustrating, as many know. For about 3/4 of it, I really did enjoy it. You know, there was this whole aspect of Tony Stark incognito or appearing dead, so he does things under the radar. But then again, there are so many generic cliches. And then, of course, the infamous Mandarin twist, which was kind of the nail in the coffin for this not being higher up my list. He was on track to being one of the best villains of the MCU. Like, he was literally there, he was in our hands, but then the dumb twist which ruined everything. It is disappointing in the end, but there are a lot of things to enjoy about it. Coming in at 18th place is Avengers Age of Ultron. The ambitions and stakes are higher than the Avengers movie. However, that is not necessarily meaning it's going to be bigger and better, because they kind of fumbled the ball a bit. This film moves too quickly while also trying to do too many things at once, so it becomes really convoluted and confusing, which is a shame because James Spader did a really good job as Ultron. He was very menacing from his voice and his delivery of lines. But yeah, the character does feel underdeveloped because of the writing, not because of what James Spader did. So while it is underwhelming, it's still very enjoyable and great to see these characters all together again because it develops their chemistry more, and there are some moments which are greater than its predecessor, but overall, too much happens and it's quite messy. After the events of Avengers Infinity War, I think it was safe to say that people needed a small-scale superhero movie to kind of calm down. That's where Ant-Man and the Wasp comes in, because I think it was never going to be one of the best Marvel movies. It does its job very well. It's that small-scale thing, you know. You look at the villains in this compared to Infinity War, that should tell you for itself. And at the end of the day, Ant-Man films are kind of like the comedies of this franchise. Having Evangeline Lilly in the field as the Wasp actually makes me like her character this time round, rather than what I'll touch upon later. But the main plot and villains are the weakest part of this, which doesn't bother me too much because, as I said, I'm just here as kind of that small-scale movie. They do become instantly forgettable, but I mean, at the end of the day, it does its job. It is mid-tier Marvel. Coming in at 16th is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. This film does continue to expand upon what its predecessor does. However, the fact that our Guardians are split up for a lot of the movie is what lets this film down, because that is the best thing about its predecessor, is when they're all together. And when they are together in this film, they are great. But as I said, they're separated for a lot of it, and what they're separated for wasn't as interesting as they thought it might be. But once you take these characters away from each other, they're not as interesting as when they are together. Coming in at 15th place is Captain America: The First Avenger. I'm rewatching it. This is a very underrated movie. It is a great origin for Captain America, and I know there are complaints about the montages that happen throughout it, but a few montages shouldn't really deduct from what is essentially a really good film, a good origin story, and a good place to start this character. The World War II setting feels great and realistic, and they allow Steve Rogers to be this really compelling character with space to grow, which eventually does happen. You'll see him at the start and compare him to the end, and that should speak for itself. So in the end, you do have a really solid origin story, with some scenes which could have been left in, which were covered in the montage, because they felt like they were good places to grow some side characters, because there weren't too many of them. Coming in at 14th place is the newly released Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. As far as experiments go for Phase 4, Shang-Chi certainly is a success. This movie takes the infamous Marvel origin story template, rips it in half, and delivers a simply unique experience. What makes it so unique is we don't just get martial arts, but we also get a big dive into Chinese culture and some of their fantastical elements, making for a very colourful movie. Simu Liu did well as Shang-Chi, but the real standout here is Tony Leung, might pronounce that wrong, who portrays the MCU's Mandarin, the real one this time, and he made for probably one of the better villains in this whole franchise, because you could sympathise with him, you understand why he's doing the things he is, and you can see that he is broken inside. As mentioned, the martial art actions is on par with Captain America and the Winter Soldier, some more creative and agile fight sequences, and as for Awkwafina, she did deliver some great comedy, but her, and along with another character, kind of wore me out with the humour. It just felt like too much at times, to the point it's like they kept repeating similar style jokes, and I just suddenly got bored of hearing them towards the end. While the final act does look visually stunning as it brings in some fantastical elements, it kind of abandons that martial arts fighting style that we were used to for the majority of the film, so I kind of didn't have as much tension as I did earlier on in the film, even though there were smaller scales, but that's just the MCU for you, and nonetheless, it was a very solid, what I consider, start to Phase 4, as it's the first real effort at moving the franchise forward. Coming in at 13th place is Spider-Man: Far From Home. Tom Holland's second solo outing as Spider-Man. He takes the character to Europe, unfamiliar territory for this character, and it leads to some very big scale and entertaining action sequences at iconic European landmarks. Everything from the predecessor continues here, the humor, the great character chemistry, that high school vibe. New additions like Mysterio, who seem like this character who is kind of hard to portray into a live action movie, does well, and Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays him as this multi-layered character, executes all of those layers to perfection. As this is the first MCU movie post Endgame, it does well to carry over the consequences of that film and what happened in it into this, and constantly reminds you of it, which may bother some, but I think it was very important to address. As time's gone on, this one slipped down my MCU list because the fact that Tony Stark left Peter Parker a multi-million-dollar device which has access to satellites, to missiles, to drones, to this character who's known for being naive at times, felt very out of Tony's character, and felt like by giving him that, he knows he could make an entertaining Spider-Man movie, which this is at the end of the day. The more I think about it, the more frustrating some aspects do get. Coming in at 12th place is Black Panther. This has always been a difficult one for me because it may be controversial, but I think this is extremely overhyped. And that's not to say it's not a good film, because it is, but this got Oscar buzz, you know, it got nominations, whereas I think there are films on this list which do deserve it more. And I know why this got Oscar buzz, and that is a huge part of this film, is the culture portrayed, whether that's through the score, the costumes, the scenery. Just Wakanda itself feels like its own well-developed character. But where I think it's overhyped is, at the end of the day, it's a very familiar story, just got a different skin on top of it. All the cast play their characters very well. Main mentions being, of course, the late Chadwick Boseman, who really does make this character his own. He's got this captivating sense of seriousness and humour as he slowly rises up the ladder of royalty. But I think the real standout from this film is Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger. He's this very complex villain who can kind of understand, whilst also you can't support what he is doing in the process. It was nice for him coming off the back of the failure of the Fantastic Four film from 2015. I like the opposite views of T'Challa and Killmonger clashing. That did end up leading to a very disappointing final battle where it has some of the MCU's worst CGI, so it kind of loses a few points off of that, but overall it is a film with a strong message which does it well, but I don't think it is one of MCU's best. Coming in at 11th place is Doctor Strange. Right off the bat, we are treated to some astonishing visuals, easily some of the best in the franchise, and I don't think that's going to be changed too often. It's not just about how they look, it's also the creativity that has gone into creating them. Like most movies, Benedict Cumberbatch does a great job of this arrogant fella who delivers and receives some very efficient dialogue which educates the viewer on this corner of the MCU. Tying in these astounding visuals, we are treated to a very unique ending where it isn't about who's the most powerful being who wins, it's about Doctor Strange's cleverness and how he goes about that. While Doctor Strange does introduce so many interesting and great things, it does draw in some of the MCU's biggest cliches with the classic Marvel superhero origin template, which is very apparent here, and not to mention, following in the footsteps of Malekith, Caecilius is another underdeveloped and forgettable villain. Maybe controversial to be this low, but coming in at 10th place is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Captain America was the third Avenger to get a sequel, and he was the first one to change genre, because the first one was sort of an action World War II movie. This is more of a spy action movie. Steve Rogers is infiltrating the corrupt government, the corrupt SHIELD. This movie does ensure some of the best hand-to-hand combat in this whole franchise, which has some more depth to it, as there is feelings from the past tied into these fights as well, which does add that bit more to it. I think the Russo brothers do make Captain America the character he is today. While he was good in his origin movie, there was still a lot to go, and this film does that good job of kind of slowly morphing him into the modern age and making him the leader that he is today. Now, why it's so far down low, you ask? I don't have any problems with it, I just prefer all the movies above this more. So I can understand why people have it so highly rated, but for me, it's still a great movie, but at this rating. Coming in at 9th place is Ant-Man. This is by far probably my most controversial opinion. This is a genuinely hilarious movie. I know I criticised the fact that Black Panther had a familiar plot, so does this one, but just the journey there is just so much more enjoyable. It's a simple heist movie, but Paul Rudd essentially playing himself, who, by the way, is my favourite actor, along with the side characters who are just as funny. I'm going to say is MCU's funniest movie. This film has this bright flair to it, which is apparent from the writing of Edgar Wright. The shrinking tech allowed for some really interesting fight scenes, or just scenes in general, including that unforgettably hilarious final battle of sorts. The problem I do have with this is two characters, Darren Cross, Yellow Jacket. He's very cartoonish, which by this point in the MCU I thought would have been gone, but no. And the other one I mentioned, Evangeline Lilly, who plays Hope. She just becomes very irritating. I know I can understand why, but she always looks to start an argument, and by the end it was very exhausting to watch it. But overall, this is one of the underrated MCU movies for me, and I have no shame in putting it this high up. Coming in at 8th place is Thor Ragnarok. Out of the big three of the Avengers, Thor, he was easily the weakest in terms of the success of his films, so that naturally didn't have me too excited for Thor Ragnarok, but my god, Taika Waititi did a fantastic job. He flipped the whole tone of all these Thor movies and the character itself on its head, bringing in humor, color, this sense of destiny which makes you constantly intrigued throughout it because you know something's going to happen with that. And he does have that nice bond with Loki which continues their arc over. Cate Blanchett was a very strong female villain in this film, easily one of the best in the franchise. Thor Ragnarok is just a blast from start to finish and has ignited a lot of people's love for Thor. I know mine included. I didn't care about him too much prior to this film, but ever since going forward, I have really enjoyed him. Coming in at 7th place is Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man Homecoming is an unfamiliar telling of the Spider-Man character, but one which I think a change has benefited it. It doesn't bother going through the classic origin story, showing the killing of his Uncle Ben. Instead, it just carries on from Captain America Civil War and just slightly mentions how he got his powers. As the title suggests, Peter Parker is in high school and we get to see an aspect from the other films that we haven't seen too much of, and that is his high school life. Tom Holland brings this highly energetic performance which does feel accurate as he is a younger Spider-Man that we've been dealing with before. And that is harnessed also thanks to his best friend, another character who we haven't seen in prior Spider-Man movies, Ned Leeds, acted well by Jacob Batalon. Michael Keaton returning to the superhero genre, this time as a villain, the Vulture, is probably my second favourite villain in this franchise. He's not trying to take over the world or anything, he's just trying to protect his family, do what's best for them, so you can kind of understand it to some extent. So the combination of the high school elements, classic MCU tropes, and just the fact that it's Spider-Man makes this 7th in my ranking. Coming in at 6th place is Guardians of the Galaxy. Upon its announcement, this seemed like a bad idea. It's taking the film into space for these characters that no one knew. It didn't feel like the right direction for this franchise. Perhaps one of the biggest risks, and it did pay off, bringing us one of the best MCU movies. When you look into the source material, you know, a talking tree, a talking raccoon, a former WWE wrestler painted blue. Did I just rhyme? And not to mention someone considered the chubby loser from Parks and Recs. They didn't seem like ingredients that would go well together to make a delicious meal, but in fact it did. I think the absurdity really does help it. As you're in space, you can pretty much do what you want. This film thrives on it, delivering not just a hilarious but an interesting view on what the galaxy is like. Not that it's bad, but the plot is one of the weaker aspects of this film, but because the characters' chemistry is so great, their humor is hilarious, just all the interactions really have your attention. You don't really focus on the plot too much, you just care about the journey there. So this is a very, very unexpected success. It's hard not to love it. Coming in at 5th place is Iron Man. Iron Man kicks off the MCU with a bang, and I think the fact that it isn't trying to attach itself to any other movies, not even really going forth, it really does help it because it can just tell its story. And just like what only Raimi trilogy of Spider-Man movies had done, and those X-Men movies, it really did execute a serious tone for a superhero movie. Because before that it was really cheesy, there's a lot of campiness that may translate to the final battle where it's a big cliche, but you can look past that as it's the start of a wonderful thing. It had no idea what it was getting into. Robert Downey Jr.'s career-saving performance as Tony Stark goes down as one of those where you can't picture anyone else in the role, and whenever someone has attempted it in a video game, maybe voicing it, it just doesn't feel right. He has this charisma as well as arrogance, but no matter how selfish he is, he's always likable and a joy to watch whenever he's on screen. Due to the compelling characters and story, you don't really notice the lack of action throughout this movie, but there isn't too much of it, but when it is here, it is great. And as I mentioned, the MCU has seen better days with final battles, but as I said, also, you can look past it as it was the start of something magical. Coming in at 4th place is The Avengers. This was the first MCU movie I watched in the cinema, and it was a very special day. I witnessed history, and the first time that I can think of that there has been a big live-action superhero team-up movie. And not just that, but the fact that it was executed to perfection. Many scenes are filled with fantastic dialogue, which does help the story flow, even when these characters are just sitting down on a helicarrier, just talking, you are constantly engaged because what they're saying is engaging. But instantly they just have this great chemistry all together, even if they're, you know, cracking jokes with each other, they're going head to head. They just all have great chemistry, maybe partly due to that Robert Downey Jr. has this charisma which maybe is infectious, but everyone just molded together as if they were friends for years. All the actors did a great job. The fact that such an ambitious project stuck the landing with the final 40 minutes devoted to a huge, high-stakes battle, it was just something out of this world, quite literally. That is when you knew the MCU was going to be one of the most successful franchises of all time, because it managed to perfectly deliver what Marvel fans have been fantasizing about for years, whilst also making it a good movie for mainstream followers to enjoy. Coming in at third place is Captain America Civil War, also known as Avengers 2.5. People have always questioned, you know, you see the Avengers destroy loads and loads of buildings in order to save the city, and they seem to go without consequences. People have always pointed that out. This film answers the question and dives deep into it. The Avengers face consequences for their actions despite doing what is right, and this is a perfect example where the MCU is not just people dressed up fighting each other with powers. It is so much more, because there's a lot of emotion packed within this film from start to finish, which eventually leads to an emotionally packed finale, which ties into the villain whose plan to bring down the Avengers is all psychological, not like a physical battle. What is so great about this film as well is the fact that our Avengers split up and fight each other, but both sides you can understand where they're coming from. So when they do fight, it's not like one's out of character, so you dislike him. You like everyone, but they're all fighting together, so you may have picked a team when you're watching it. I think I picked Team Iron Man, but you still care about the other characters. Like, you wouldn't want to see, you know, a battle where one of them kills the other Avenger. So this is one of the more emotionally packed Marvel movies, which it's not really praised enough for its emotion, but certainly it does impact you and you're constantly engaged, and that's why I have it in my top 3. Coming in at second place is Avengers Infinity War. We're now heading into the two big guns. In terms of size, Avengers Infinity War is perhaps one of the biggest ensemble superhero movies, as well as size in terms of execution. The first time we see people from different pocket franchises within this franchise interact, you know, we see the Guardians of the Galaxy meet Thor, we see Doctor Strange and Tony Stark meet. But not just that, they all fight together against one big foe, and that is Thanos, who is easily my favourite villain of this whole franchise. He'd been teased for years and you were like, oh, wondering what that's all about. But now you know. It is huge, the stakes are huge, and in time that delivers one of the most shocking cinematic experiences I have ever experienced, and I'm sure has gone down in history for the exact thing. No one expected our heroes to die. There was this whole thing about, oh well, these superheroes can't die, so what are the stakes really? And you see why in this film there are stakes. I know a lot of them do come back in a film, which we'll talk about next, but there are stakes because some of them don't come back. And there was a point where, like, a whole year we had to wait where our Avengers are technically dead, even though we all knew they were going to come back. So many thought Infinity War was going to be the big climax. We of course knew there's going to be 2 parts, but as a whole we thought Infinity War was going to be a climax, but you never expected them to kill off half of the universe, and that's what happens here. So where we thought this would be the big climax comes in at number 1. That sounds a bit weird. But coming in at first place is my favourite movie of all time, Avengers Endgame. Look, this is such a special movie. I could talk about this film for hours, and I was literally high off this film for months before its release and after its release. After the events of what happens in Infinity War, this picks up right after, and it has this really serious tone to an extent which we haven't experienced before, because every character is devastated, they're broken after what's happened. We have a huge time jump, and it perfectly warrants this 3-hour runtime. People criticize that it uses Thor as an insensitive joke of depression, which, yeah, I can understand. People didn't like Hulk. I liked him. They just didn't like he wasn't as big and bad as before, but I still liked him. It made sense. This is such a special film, and I was lucky enough to see this premiering at midnight, the day where I had an exam, but I had no regrets. The only thing that I hated about it was the fact, because I saw it early, I couldn't talk to anyone about it, so I was like, I was going mad, but literally I saw it at midnight on its release. Went to school the next morning, had an exam, and then after school went with my friends, and like when it got to the last hour where this is total fan service but earned fan service, which was an extremely special moment. I was just looking around at my friends being like, I know what's about to happen. Literal chills throughout that whole hour, and literally it was something special. I'm literally still lost for words. I was grateful to be one of the first people in the world to experience it. It was a fitting conclusion to this whole saga. People were nowadays saying they want to see Tony Stark and Steve Rogers pop up in some projects. I don't personally. I think where they left off is perfect enough. Even if they showed up in What If, which they haven't, I'd feel like, you know, that's not their final goodbye. So I'm kind of glad they haven't, even though the voice cast might sound a bit weird. But this is a very special film to me, which I have undying amounts of love for, and that's why it comes in as number one in my favorite franchise, and also number one in my favorite films of all time. That concludes my long ranking of the MCU films. My throat's so sore, my arm is sore, I've just had my vaccination, and I've got a headache, so please like and subscribe. This was a lot of effort, and of course, as more Marvel films come out, I'll have to update it, meaning it's gonna be longer. But I love talking every minute about these Marvel films, and I can do it for hours, but maybe I just need a glass of water with me. Anyways, please like and subscribe. I hope you did enjoy. If you want to see my previous video, which is a Candyman ranking, I'll leave a clickable card up in the corner here. I'm not sure if I'll be covering any more MCU videos in these next few days because it's quite a busy part of this month, especially after an inactive previous month. So we'll see, considering it's such a big list, it's such a big video as well. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.